At 2 a.m., the Black Maid answered a cry for help, not knowing it was the Mafia Boss's daughter. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Renee Walker had learned the quiet language of large houses at night, the way the air seemed heavier after midnight, and every sound carried farther than it should. At 2 in the morning, the estate rested under a blanket of controlled silence, the kind that came from money and rules, and people who expected obedience even from the walls. Renee moved carefully, soft shoes gliding across polished floors that reflected the low amber lights, like calm water. She was the night maid, trusted with cleaning what others left behind, but never with asking questions. And she had survived long enough by understanding that invisibility was not a weakness, but a shield. Her shift had started at 10, ended at 6, and between those hours she existed in the narrow space where no one looked twice. Renee wiped down a side table near the east hallway, counting the minutes the way she always did, when a sound cut through the stillness and made her hand pause in midair. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't sudden. It was a small sound, broken and uneven, like someone trying not to cry but failing. Renee held her breath. Houses like this were full of alarms she couldn't see, rules she couldn't read, consequences she couldn't afford. She told herself it was nothing, maybe the wind against the old windows or a television left on somewhere behind a closed door. She took a step back, then another, ready to return to her work, when the sound came again, clearer this time, followed by a whisper so faint it felt almost imagined. Please, someone help me. Renee's chest tightened. She had heard that tone once before in another life, in a smaller apartment that smelled of detergent and warm milk, and the memory pressed against her ribs. Without warning, she knew better than to move toward unfamiliar rooms, especially at night, especially on this side of the house, but her feet hesitated as if they belonged to someone else. Renee glanced down the hallway, empty and dim, then at the cleaning cart beside her, the symbol of her safety and her place. The whisper came again, trembling and scared, and this time it carried a child's rhythm, uneven and fragile. Renee closed her eyes for a brief second, long enough to make a decision she would later realize had already been made. She moved toward the sound, steps slow and careful, her heart beating louder with each one. The door to the small sitting room was cracked open, light spilling through the narrow gap, and from inside came a soft sob that made her stomach twist. Renee pushed the door just enough to see, not knowing who lived there, not knowing whose rules she was breaking, only knowing that someone inside was alone and afraid at 2 in the morning. In that moment, she did not think about the owner of the house, or the power tied to the name carved into the gates outside. She thought only of the cry that had found her in the dark, and she stepped forward, unaware that this single choice would quietly alter the course of every life under that roof. Renee stepped fully into the sitting room and gently closed the door behind her, not because she wanted privacy, but because the soft click felt like a promise that the night could still be kept calm. The room was smaller than the others she cleaned, arranged more like a forgotten corner than a place meant to be lived in, with a couch pushed too close to the wall and a lamp left on low as if someone had meant to return and never did. Beneath a long table, half hidden by heavy drapes, sat a little girl no older than 8, knees pulled tight to her chest, dark hair tangled from sleep, eyes wide and glassy with fear. Renee lowered herself slowly, careful not to startle her, keeping her voice low and steady the way she had once learned to do when fear filled a room faster than words. "It is okay, sweetheart," she said softly, staying several feet away. "You are not in trouble." The girl swallowed hard, pressing her palm against her stomach as if holding herself together. "I cannot find anyone," she whispered. "I woke up and it hurt, and nobody came." Renee nodded as if that made perfect sense, because to a child awake at night, it always did. She glanced at the small digital clock on the shelf, glowing 2:14 a.m., then back to the girl, who was shivering despite the room being warm. Renee slipped off her cardigan and held it out, letting it rest on the floor between them instead of reaching forward. "You can take it if you want," she said. The girl hesitated, then crawled closer and wrapped it around her shoulders, breathing out a shaky sigh that sounded like relief, trying to remember how to exist. Renee stayed right where she was, her knees aching against the hardwood, her attention fixed on the small rise and fall of the child's chest. She asked simple questions, nothing that demanded answers too big for the night, just enough to understand. Did you feel sick before you went to sleep? Did you have water? Did anyone know you were awake? Each answer came softly, incomplete, stitched together by long pauses. Renee noticed the heat of the girl's skin when she brushed her own fingers together, the kind of warmth that was not right, the kind that made worry sit heavy in the throat. She thought about calling for help, about alarms and protocols she did not know, but the child's hand reached out and clutched the sleeve of her uniform, holding on with quiet desperation. "Please do not go," the girl said, her voice barely there. Renee did not pull away. She did not promise anything either. She simply stayed, grounding herself in the moment the way she had learned after loss taught her that panic only made things louder. She shifted closer, careful and slow, using the edge of her cardigan to gently dab the child's forehead, murmuring reassurance without explaining what could not yet be explained. Outside the room, the house remained silent, unaware of the small circle of trust forming on its polished floor. Renee did not know whose child this was, or what power lived behind the locked doors and guarded hallways of the estate. In that moment, she knew only that someone small had asked for help, and that leaving now would feel like another kind of harm. So she stayed, listening to the uneven breaths slowly begin to steady, not realizing that every second she knelt there was quietly reshaping a future she had never imagined herself touching. Renee stayed with the girl as the minutes passed, measuring time not by the clock, but by the way the child's breathing slowly softened, the tightness in her small shoulders easing as trust settled in. The girl said her name was Lily, and that alone felt like something precious being handed over, a fragile thing that deserved care. Renee repeated it quietly, Lily, letting the sound ground them both. She asked if Lily had eaten earlier, if she felt dizzy, if the room felt too bright, keeping her questions gentle and spaced apart so they did not overwhelm her. Lily shook her head at most of them, eyes fluttering as if sleep wanted to return but could not quite find its way. Renee noticed the faint sheen of sweat along Lily's hairline and the way her hands trembled when she tried to pull the cardigan tighter. Renee thought about the supplies on her cart, a small bottle of water, a clean cloth, nothing special, nothing meant for moments like this, yet sometimes small things were all you had. She reached slowly, making sure Lily watched every movement, and held out the water. "Just a sip if you want," she said. Lily drank carefully, then leaned her head against the edge of the couch, eyes half closed. Renee stayed close without touching, aware of how easily comfort could turn into fear if crossed too quickly. She remembered nights long ago when she had sat beside a tiny bed, counting breaths, listening for changes, promising herself she would never leave, and the memory tightened her throat before she gently set it aside. This was not the time for old grief. This was the time for presence. She adjusted the lamp, lowering the light just a little, and the room seemed to exhale with them. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked, then settled again, a reminder that this place was never truly empty. Renee's heart jumped despite herself. She glanced at the door, then back at Lily, who was now watching her with sleepy focus. "Are you going to get in trouble?" Lily asked suddenly, her voice small. Renee smiled softly, the kind of smile that did not promise more than it could keep. "Right now," she said, "all that matters is that you feel better." Lily nodded as if that answer made sense in the simple logic of childhood. The heat of Lily's skin worried Renee, and she knew she could not wait forever. She needed to find help without leaving Lily alone, a problem with no perfect solution. Renee stood just enough to peek into the hallway, listening carefully, then returned to her place when the house offered only silence. She sat back down, crossing her legs so she was level with Lily again. "We are going to take this 1 minute at a time," she said, more to herself than to the child. Lily's eyes closed fully then, her breathing deepening as exhaustion finally claimed her. Renee watched closely, counting quietly, noting the rhythm, staying alert for any change. She did not know who Lily belonged to, what kind of world waited beyond the door, or how many rules she was breaking by simply being here. What she knew was that at this hour, in this quiet room, she had become the only steady thing Lily could hold on to. Outside, the clock ticked forward, the estate holding its breath, as Renee remained on the floor beside the sleeping child, unaware that someone else in the house had begun to notice that something was not as it should be. Renee jolted when Lily stirred, a soft whimper slipping out as the child's breathing hitched, and Renee leaned in, alert to the smallest change. Lily's forehead felt warmer than before, not scalding but wrong in a way that pressed urgency into Renee's chest. She checked the clock again, 2:29 a.m., the digits glowing like a quiet warning, and weighed what she knew against what she feared. Leaving Lily alone was not an option, but staying without help felt like a slow gamble. Renee spoke softly, keeping her tone steady so the words did not wake panic. "Lily, can you hear me, sweetheart?" Lily nodded faintly, eyes half open, unfocused. Renee guided another sip of water, then gently adjusted the cardigan so it covered Lily's arms. She remembered what doctors once told her about fevers, about comfort, about watching and waiting, about not doing harm when you were unsure. She knew her limits, and that knowledge sharpened the decision she could no longer avoid. Renee glanced toward the door. Again, listening for footsteps, for any sign of staff, but the house answered with silence. The rules echoed in her mind. The warnings given on her first night: never enter private rooms, never interfere, never assume permission where none was given. Renee exhaled slowly, then made a choice that felt both small and enormous. She would not leave Lily, but she would call for help in the only way she could. Renee reached for the small phone clipped to her belt, the one meant for emergencies related to maintenance, not moments like this. Her thumb hovered as she considered which number to dial, aware that every option carried consequences. Before she could decide, Lily's hand tightened around her sleeve again, eyes suddenly wide with fear. "Do not let them take me away," Lily whispered, the words tumbling out with the confusion of a child half lost to fever. Renee swallowed, the promise forming in her chest before she spoke it. "No one is taking you anywhere tonight," she said gently. "I am right here." Lily's breathing eased again, and Renee stayed close, shifting her position so she could brace Lily's back with her arm without lifting her, careful to keep the contact light and reassuring. She began to hum, low and slow, a tune without words that carried steadiness rather than memory, letting the sound fill the space between them. The room seemed to settle, the shadows holding their place as the minutes passed. Then, from somewhere beyond the walls, came the faint sound of a door opening, followed by measured footsteps moving through the distant hallway. Renee's heart quickened, but she did not pull away. She lowered her voice further, humming without pause, making herself smaller, less threatening, a constant presence Lily could cling to. The footsteps grew nearer, then paused, as if someone were listening just beyond the threshold of the sitting room. Renee felt the weight of being seen even before it happened, the sense that this quiet moment was no longer hidden. She kept her focus on Lily, smoothing the cardigan once more, her posture protective without being possessive. Whatever came next would come to her here, on the floor beside a sleeping child, with no defenses beyond calm and truth. The handle on the door shifted slightly, and Renee held her breath, unaware that the world she had carefully kept at a distance was about to step directly into the circle she had built around Lily. Renee did not notice the door open at first because her attention was fixed entirely on Lily, on the way the child's breathing had become shallow again and the faint crease between her eyebrows returned as if discomfort were creeping back. Renee shifted closer, her movements slow and deliberate, angling her body to block the light from the hallway without realizing it, a reflex born from nights spent protecting something fragile. She pressed the back of her hand gently against Lily's cheek, gauging the warmth, then withdrew, mindful of not startling her awake. Lily stirred, murmuring something Renee could not make out, and Renee leaned in, humming softly once more, letting the sound vibrate low in her chest where calm lived. She thought about the limits of what she could do and the power of what she could offer, about how sometimes the most important thing was not fixing the problem, but making sure someone did not face it alone. Renee pulled the cardigan higher around Lily's shoulders and adjusted the child's position so her head rested more comfortably against the couch, using her own knee as a steady anchor. Lily's small fingers curled into the fabric of Renee's uniform, and Renee let them stay there, grounding both of them. She whispered reassurance, words without promises, reminding Lily to breathe slowly, to listen to the hum, to stay with the moment. The room felt smaller now, warmer, as if the space itself were bending inward to protect the quiet bond forming on the floor. Renee's thoughts flickered briefly to the consequences waiting beyond the door, to the authority and expectations that ruled this house, but she pushed them aside. None of that mattered here. What mattered was the child whose trust rested in her hands. She noticed the way Lily's breathing began to even out again, the tension easing just enough to allow rest to take hold. Renee allowed herself a small breath of relief, careful not to move too much, staying still so the fragile calm would not break. She watched the clock tick forward, 2:41 a.m., time moving in tiny, relentless steps, and wondered how many moments like this passed unseen every night. Renee adjusted her posture, shifting her weight so her arm would not tire, and kept humming, the tune looping softly without an end. She felt the presence at the doorway before she saw it, a change in the air, the subtle pressure of being observed. Renee did not turn. She did not freeze. She continued exactly as she was, her focus unwavering, her body language clear in its intent. Lily slept now, fully this time, her face relaxed in a way that spoke of temporary relief, her grip loosening but not letting go. Renee's mind registered the silhouette in her peripheral vision, tall and still, but she refused to let fear dictate her next breath. She had crossed too many lines already to retreat into silence now. She placed her hand gently over Lily's, offering warmth without possession, and stayed where she was. If someone was watching, she wanted them to see this moment exactly as it was, uncomplicated by explanations or excuses. A woman on the floor beside a sleeping child, choosing care over caution, presence over permission. Renee remained there, steady and unflinching, unaware that the man standing in the doorway was seeing something he had not encountered in years, something no amount of control or power could command, and that this quiet act of care was already changing the shape of the night. Renee finally turned her head when the presence at the doorway shifted from stillness to intention, and her eyes met his for the first time. He stood framed by the open door, tall and composed, dressed simply for the hour, his expression unreadable in the low light. Renee recognized him instantly, not by photographs or whispers, but by the way the room seemed to acknowledge him, the subtle gravity that followed his every movement. Victor Castellano did not speak. He did not step forward. He only looked, his gaze moving from Renee on the floor to the sleeping child curled against her, then back again, measuring without interruption. Renee felt the weight of his attention settle on her shoulders, yet she did not rise, did not pull away, did not place herself between him and Lily in a way that could be mistaken for defiance. She stayed exactly as she was, one hand resting lightly near Lily's shoulder, the other braced against the floor, her posture open and calm. The silence stretched, deep and deliberate, broken only by Lily's slow breathing and the quiet hum Renee had not yet stopped. Victor took a single step into the room, then another, his movements careful, almost restrained, as if he were entering a place that required permission no one had taught him how to ask for. He noticed details most men would have missed, the cardigan wrapped around Lily, the bottle of water within reach, the way Renee angled her body to shield the child from drafts rather than from him. He noticed the absence of panic, the absence of calculation. Renee looked up at him again, her voice steady when she spoke, low enough not to wake Lily. "She has a fever," she said simply. She was scared and alone. That was all. Victor nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, then crouched several feet away, lowering himself to the child's level without crossing the space Renee had claimed. He studied Lily's face, the color of her cheeks, the faint furrow in her brow even in sleep, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He had searched the house for her moments earlier, his frustration building with every empty room, every unanswered call, and now here she was, asleep on the floor beside a woman he barely knew, calmer than she had been all night. Victor's voice, when he finally used it, was quiet and controlled, stripped of command. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. Renee answered without embellishment, recounting only what she had observed, careful not to accuse or explain beyond necessity. Victor listened, truly listened, his attention never wavering from Lily. He reached out, hesitated, then rested the back of his fingers briefly against Lily's forehead, confirming what Renee had already known. He withdrew his hand and looked at Renee again, seeing her not as staff, not as a rule broken, but as a variable he had not anticipated. "You did the right thing," he said, the words unadorned, carrying weight precisely because of their rarity. Renee did not respond immediately. She simply inclined her head, acceptance without expectation. Victor straightened slowly and glanced toward the hallway, where help could be summoned with a single word, then back to the quiet circle on the floor. He remained there, neither dismissing Renee nor disrupting the fragile peace she had created, understanding instinctively that whatever came next had to be built on what she had already given. In the soft glow of the lamp, the power of the house shifted, not through orders or authority, but through the recognition that care, freely given, had already changed the balance of the night. Victor remained crouched for a long moment, his attention divided between the child sleeping peacefully and the woman who had made that possible without knowing who she was dealing with. He was used to rooms responding to him instantly, to people straightening their backs or lowering their eyes the second he entered, yet Renee did neither. She stayed where she was, breathing slow and even, her focus never straying far from Lily, as if the world beyond that small space no longer existed. Victor studied her quietly, noting the absence of fear in her posture, the lack of performance in her calm. It unsettled him more than panic ever could. He had built his life around control, around knowing the cost and benefit of every decision. Yet this moment offered him no such calculations. Renee had not acted for recognition or safety or advantage. She had acted because a child cried. Victor straightened slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his voice low when he spoke again. "You did not know who she was," he said, not as an accusation but as a statement. Renee met his gaze steadily and shook her head once. "No, sir," she replied. Victor nodded, a subtle shift crossing his expression, something like relief mixed with humility. He looked back at Lily, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, and felt the sharp edge of guilt press against him. He had trusted systems and schedules, layers of protection that were meant to keep her safe, yet it was the quiet presence of someone invisible that had made the difference. He glanced toward the door, then back again, choosing not to call for anyone yet. He wanted to understand this moment before it dissolved into procedure. Renee adjusted her position slightly when Lily stirred, her movements instinctive, practiced, the kind that came from memory rather than instruction. Victor noticed how Lily leaned into that touch without waking, seeking comfort without fear. It struck him then how rare it was to see his daughter trust so completely, how guarded she had become since her mother died, how few people she allowed close. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and let his shoulders relax for the first time that night. He spoke again. "Softer now. You stayed with her," he said. Renee nodded, her voice calm. "She asked for help. I could not leave her alone." There was no apology in her tone, no expectation of praise. Victor absorbed that, the simplicity of the truth settling heavily in his chest. He realized that if Renee had known who Lily was, the moment would have been different, filtered through caution and fear, shaped by the weight of his name. Instead, what Lily had received was something pure, unmeasured by consequence. Victor shifted closer, careful not to wake his daughter, and lowered his voice further. "She has been restless all night," he admitted, a rare confession. Nothing seemed to calm her. Renee listened without interrupting, her attention still anchored to Lily, but Victor felt seen in a way he had not expected. He nodded once more, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed without his permission and yet with his deepest gratitude. Victor straightened and made a quiet decision, one that would ripple outward long after this night ended. He would not remove Renee from this moment. He would not replace her with authority or distance. He would let the care she had offered continue, because it was working. Victor looked down at Lily, then back at Renee, and in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding that this night had crossed a boundary neither of them could step back over. The house remained still, the hours slipping closer to morning, as Victor stayed beside them, no longer the most powerful man in the room, but simply a father witnessing the quiet grace of someone who had chosen compassion without knowing its cost. The night moved forward almost imperceptibly, the clock inching toward 3 as the house adjusted to a new center of gravity. Lily stirred again, her brow tightening briefly before relaxing, and Renee responded without thinking, her hand rising to rest lightly against the child's back, a steadying presence that spoke louder than words. Victor watched this exchange with a focus that bordered on reverence, realizing how rarely he had seen such uncomplicated care offered without expectation. He rose quietly and stepped toward the doorway, pausing to listen for movement in the hall before returning, carrying a folded blanket he had taken from a nearby chair. He held it out to Renee without comment, and she accepted it, with a nod, draping it gently over Lily so the child would not wake. The simple coordination between them required no discussion, only attention. Victor settled back down at a respectful distance, his posture relaxed, his voice kept low when he spoke. "She always sleeps lighter when she is not feeling well," he said, as if sharing a secret rather than stating a fact. Renee listened, absorbing the rhythm of a father learning how to speak in the quiet spaces. She did not offer advice. She simply remained present. Minutes passed. Lily's breathing deepened, steadier now, the fever no longer climbing, held in check by rest and reassurance. Victor glanced at the clock and then at Renee, a decision forming that surprised even him. He reached for his phone, typed a brief message, and put it away without making a call, choosing discretion over disruption. He had entire teams trained to respond to crises, yet tonight he chose restraint, trusting the calm that had already been established. Renee noticed the shift and understood it without question. She did not ask what would happen next. She had learned long ago that some choices were best respected by silence. Lily murmured again, her fingers tightening briefly before relaxing, and Renee adjusted the blanket, her movements unhurried. Victor felt something loosen inside him, a knot he had carried since the night his wife died, when fear had taught him to guard rather than to feel. Watching his daughter rest against the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to gain from the act forced him to confront a truth he had avoided. Protection was not only about barriers and control. Sometimes it was about allowing the right person to stay. He looked at Renee, really looked at her, seeing the lines of exhaustion softened by resolve, the steadiness that came from surviving without becoming hard. He spoke again, his voice even, measured. "She trusts you," he said. Renee met his gaze briefly, then returned her attention to Lily. "I am just staying with her," she replied. Victor accepted that answer for what it was, neither diminishing nor elevating it. The night outside the room remained still, the estate holding its breath as if aware that something fundamental had shifted. Victor knew that by morning, routines would return, questions would be asked, systems would reassert themselves, but he also knew that this moment would not be erased. It would linger in the way he looked at his staff, in the way Lily reached for comfort, in the decisions he would make when control tempted him to forget compassion. He remained there with them until the first hint of dawn pressed faintly against the windows, not as a man overseeing a situation, but as a father bearing witness to quiet justice unfolding without ceremony. And in that stillness, Renee stayed beside Lily, not knowing what the future would hold, only knowing that for this night, dignity had found a place to rest. Morning arrived quietly, not with alarms or voices, but with a pale light easing through the windows and settling gently over the room. Lily slept on, her breathing steady and calm, the fever finally broken, her small hand still resting against Renee's sleeve as if anchoring herself to something safe. Renee had not moved all night except when Lily needed her, and now she felt the ache in her legs and the weight of exhaustion pressed down, yet she did not pull away. Victor stood and watched them for a long moment, committing the image to memory, aware that this was not a scene of urgency anymore, but of resolution. When Lily finally stirred, her eyes opening slowly to the unfamiliar sight of her father nearby, she did not startle or cry. Instead, she looked up at Renee first, her voice soft and clear. "You stayed," she said. Renee smiled, relief warming her chest. "Yes, sweetheart." Lily turned her head and reached for Victor, and he lifted her carefully, holding her close as she rested her head against his shoulder, calmer than she had been in days. He met Renee's eyes then, gratitude present but restrained, understanding that some things did not need to be spoken aloud. Later, as Lily was settled back into her room with sunlight touching the edges of her bed, Victor walked Renee to the doorway of the sitting room where everything had begun. The house felt different now, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "You should rest," he said simply. Renee nodded, unsure of what to expect next, but trusting the tone of his voice. As she turned to leave, Victor stopped her, not with authority, but with intention. "She asked for you when she woke," he said. Renee paused, absorbing the weight of that statement, then inclined her head once more. "I will be nearby," she replied. The day unfolded without spectacle. No raised voices, no reprimands, no explanations demanded. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Word traveled softly through the house, not as gossip, but as recognition. Eyes that once passed over Renee now lingered with respect. Instructions were given without sharpness. Doors that had always felt closed seemed less forbidding. Victor carried the change with him into every decision he made that day, measuring his power not by what he could command, but by what he chose to protect. For Renee, life did not transform into something grand or dramatic. She returned to her work with the same quiet diligence, but the weight she carried felt lighter, the space she occupied more visible. Lily sought her out in small ways, a glance, a smile, a hand slipped into hers during quiet moments, and Victor allowed it, understanding now that trust could not be forced, only earned. There was no announcement, no reward proclaimed, no public acknowledgement of what had occurred in the early hours of the morning. Yet in the stillness that followed, a deeper justice settled into place. Respect was restored where it had never been formally taken but quietly withheld. Compassion reshaped power without confrontation. And in that house, long governed by control and silence, dignity found its way back into the smallest moments. The room where it had all begun stood empty again, unchanged in appearance, yet marked forever by what had passed within it. And though the night faded into memory, its lesson endured, carried forward in the way a father held his daughter, and in the way a woman who had once been invisible was never truly unseen again.